So whenever you're ready.
Yep.
I'm good, sure.
All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 470 monthly meeting, presentation, I should say. I'd like to introduce, please welcome tonight's presenter, Phil Morse, who was born right here in Portland and now resides in Saco. He is a former trustee, president, CEO, and executive director to the Seashore Trolley Museum located in Kennebunkport. Currently, he is the sponsor for the restoration of the 1912 Portland Lewis
Interurban.
Interurban number 14. With 600,000 total views, Phil is the administrator for their blog that features this project. Tonight, Phil is going to share and highlight the history of the Portland Lewiston Interurban, the longevity of
Narcissus.
number 14, and the current project restoration. So let's welcome Phil to our meeting tonight. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening. And we'll get started. I appreciate the invitation. Alan, thank you for connecting with me through James, and for all the help from Sean and Eric and Jack. Appreciate it. Today is November 20th, 2024. And I'm going to start off by giving a little background on the Seashore Trolley Museum. Let's see how this works. So I press that one, I press these,
They'll try it.
all right. So I've been a member of Seashore Trolley Museum since 1991, and this is our 85th anniversary year, and we are the very first trolley museum in the whole world, and the largest trolley museum in the whole world. And so you can see by the photo in the bottom left, you can go on a mainline ride. It's about 1.5 miles one way. There's a loop, but the right of way, we own the right of way of the original Atlantic shoreline that goes another 2.5 or 3 miles. So it's about a 4 or 5 mile right of way that in the future, maybe it'll be expanded. And you can see the close-up from the center photo right there. This is a Connecticut car that arrived at the museum as a complete operating car in 1948, built in 1906. And a couple of years ago, this is the second year we've had a contract with Revolution Rail, a rail bike system. And thousands of people come and go on that, and it becomes part of the Seashore Trolley Museum exhibit and experience for people to ride. We have actually 3 new buildings that opened this year, 2024. The first one on the left over here is the South Boston Car Barn, and this is with track, and so the overhead is being done now. And then to the right is a new maintenance building. Well, I'm going to see if I can scoot up a little bit. The third building is this building in the bottom left-hand corner, which is housing a model railroad of the Central Maine Railroad. It's the largest Central Maine Railroad, model railroad set up in New England. And it's still, the second floor is going to have some renovations, or actually construction, because it's brand new on the second floor this winter, but it's actually going to be open year-round, which will be our first year-round presence for the public ever. From a volunteer standpoint, we've had volunteers and paid staff that do things year-round, but this will be the first time we've had a public presence by having the model railroad open. And as you can see, I've put here that for Christmas Prelude in Kennebunkport, there's a couple of special openings for people to come check out this model railroad, and it's on Thursdays. And so for a $3 fee, it's good through the whole day. And you might want to try your hand at operating, and if the weather's good, you'll be able to do a little cooking marshmallows outside. So it's a wonderful setup. A brand new an event. I'm gonna scroll up a little bit here. We do a lot of special events. Pumpkin Patch event. This was our 26th year of having our annual Pumpkin Patch Trolley event. We had 4,680 guests attend that this year. We have Christmas Prelude coming up that I mentioned. And again, that's very good turnout for the first 2 weekends in December. You might want to check that out. You can get tickets in advance. Oops, I'm gonna learn to use this a little bit better here somehow. It was shared with me through the Trolley Museum that on November 2nd, early this month, there's a YouTube channel called Great Documentaries that released this new post called Trolleys, American Traditions. And the first 20 minutes of that is about the history of trolleys in the whole US. So if you're wondering what impact it had around the whole country, this is a great first 20 minutes. They do a terrific job of explaining that. And then the documentary was originally released in 1999. And it was shown on public television in Canada and all through the US. And it features 3 major trolley museums in the country, Seashore Trolley Museum being the first one, because we're the first museum in the country. And then it goes to Chicago, and then it goes to California. And the opening trolleys that operate in the opening of that documentary series, the first 5 are all at Seashore Trolley Museum. And that was filmed in October of 1998 during our members weekend. And so that's a great, it came out as a VHS tape originally, and then a few years later it came out as a DVD. But that's certainly something I'd encourage you to take a look at if you want to learn more about what impact streetcars had on the economy and on people in the whole country. Let's see if that works. Goes a little too fast. The next thing is I do a blog, work with the administrator is the executive director of the Trolley Museum and myself, and I feature different posts. It has over 300 posts, and it's approaching, as you heard, 600,000 page views. So if you want to know about Maine electric railways, I released a different blog post on every electric railway that ever operated in Maine. I did that for the bicentennial. And then I, of course, will do highlights and features of different ones. So recently I did one on the Portland Railroad, because there was talk about moving, having the train station be moved from where it is now for the Downeaster, putting it back on St. John Street, kind of where it was back in Union Station, somewhere along there. So the original trolley line was in part on there as well, as far as their car barn, because it was a horse-drawn system initially. And so that was on St. John Street. And then the maintenance garage was on St. John Street, and the car barn house was on. So I did a whole blog post just on St. John Street from when it was horse-drawn right up through to when it ended. But I do, Theodore Roosevelt was a passenger on the Narcissus, which I'll be talking about later. And that got me into research about Theodore Roosevelt's connections in Maine. So now with the Presidential Library being constructed in North Dakota, it's going to be opened on July 4th, 2026. Then when they broke ground, I said, well, I got to release this project I've been thinking about. And so I released the Theodore Roosevelt Maine Heritage Trail project all through blogs. He's connected with more than 30 different communities here in Maine. And so I did a separate blog post about each of those communities, whether it's Kennebunk or Kennebunkport or Portland. He visited Portland a number of times. But his very first visit to Maine was when he was 13 years old. He took a train. They put him on a train in New York and sent him to Dexter, Maine, where he took a stagecoach to Greenville, and then hung out at Moosehead and did some stuff, and then took the stagecoach back and took the train back home. He was 13 years old. So you can, there's a lot of things. So you can go to the Narcissus blog and find any number of stories about any number of things that are Seashore Trolley Museum related, electric railways in Maine, Theodore Roosevelt in Maine. I independently published a book called Teddy Roosevelt, Millie and the Elegant Ride. The Elegant Ride is the Narcissus, and that took place here on August 18th, 1914, right through West Cumberland, Gray, He was a passenger on the Narcissus from Lewiston to Portland, but we'll get into that a little more. So now we're going to get into the history here of the PLI. Originally, it was not named the Portland Lewiston Interurban. It was named the Portland Gray and Lewiston. Portland Gray and Lewiston, yeah. And they started construction in 1910-ish, and W. Scott Libby was the owner of the Libby Dingley Dam and the Libby Dingley Mills and other mills in the Lewiston area. And there's a newspaper article about him and a couple of the people starting construction on that. So that was, like I say, in 1910. Now, W. Scott Libby was a very interesting man, and the research, again, I just find him to be incredible, along with Theodore Roosevelt. I actually did a comparison of the two of them. I didn't release it as a blog, but I did it for the Libby family to show them a presentation about their comparison about how they worked and who they are and what impact they had on their communities. And so you can see this postcard shows Lisbon and Main Street in Lewiston at Hewlett Square. So this building here, the building is still there, and upstairs used to be where the Lewiston newspaper was published and done. And downstairs, back in the late 1800s, is where the telegraph, system was. And W.S. Libby worked for the Western Union Telegraph and was an operator. And so by being downstairs from the newspaper, because he was always making every day with the newspaper, because he was, typing out all these, messages, and he was highly respected as a telegraph operator. So he became personal friends with the son of the fellow who owned the Lewiston system. So that's Henry Dingley. And so the two of them became partners. Now, of course, Henry Dingley had the financial aspect, and W.S. Libby had the creativity and the entrepreneur aspect and the ideas. And so they started partnering. And where this was the sort of the hub for Lewiston at the time, initially it was horse-drawn cars, but then it became electrified. They built on that, and I'll talk about that. So Scott Libby, born in 1851 in Avon, but became the city's most dynamic industrialist during Lewiston's post-Civil War period of the economic expansion. And so he got involved with Lincoln Mill, which had the water rights to the Androscoggin when he bought that in 1893. And with those water rights, he built a dam because he had purchased two little starting electric light companies. And actually, one of those companies owned the other one, but he had them both early on. So then he got the water rights because he bought that mill. He built a dam. It was you can see it's the Libby Dingley Dam, so he could generate more power. Now, those early electric companies, where their revenue source wasn't electricity for homes. In 1910, several years down from when this was going on, about 10% of the population in Maine had electricity. But back then, that was not going to be a giant revenue source. So the three major revenue sources for the early electric companies was if they could get a contract with a community, a city, a town, and provide the electricity to light Main Street, as an example. That was one source. If there was mills in the towns, if they could provide the electricity to generate power for some of the equipment to generate stuff in the mills, that was a source. But the single biggest source was if they could get a contract to supply the electricity for an electric streetcar railway. And so, again, Libby being the entrepreneur and the big picture thinker, he was like, okay, if I buy an electric company, I have these mills, there's a customer for me. If I can supply electricity to the main streets, there's a customer for me. We need a direct line of electric railway to go from Lewiston to Portland. There was an indirect, you could go from Portland, but you have to go up the coast to Brunswick and over, so you might have to change trolleys 2 or 3 times, and it might take 3 hours, 3¼ hours just to go from Portland to Lewiston because you're going around the corners. So he was able to acquire what was going on with that, and ultimately started this construction of the Portland, Gray, Lewiston line. And when that line was built, because he first had to have it surveyed, one of his grandchildren is still with us today, Paul Libby. He's 95, 96 years old now, and still owns one of his grandfather's mills in Lewiston, along with his sons. And he was kind enough to give me, for the museum, for the Trolley Museum, the original surveyor's map of the 30-mile right-of-way between Auburn and Portland. And I was able to raise the $11,000 and have it completely conserved and have a copy of it made. It's 28.5 feet long, and it's missing 1.5 feet. So originally it was 30 feet long, about 1 foot for every mile of the right-of-way. And you can see in this picture here that as they're doing the conservation in Andover, Mass, they were really thrilled to have this as a project to work on. And they did a terrific job, and they were able to make a 28.5-foot copy. So we have that we can use in exhibits or displays as we're putting the stuff together once the Narcissus is complete, and we're putting together all those exhibits and stuff. So this is a cool thing, and so, you know, thanks to Mr. Libby, and he has many more items within the family from the railway too that, you know, we'll be sharing hopefully in the future. Let's see. So you might be familiar with Charles Heseltine, because he was worked for the South Portland Fire Department for many, many years. He helped establish the Electric Railroaders Association in the Portland Division in 1937, 38. And so he was really an incredible individual in communicating with historical societies throughout Maine. In particular, I'll say the central and southern part of Maine. But he provided all the maps that, and I brought one of the books in today, but it's this Maine Street and Electric Railways. So O.R. Cummings was our historian for 50 years and personally published 60 books on electric railways all through New England. And O.R. Cummings would work with Charles Heseltine. And in this particular case, the Trolley Museum's library committee got together and they published this book, which uses all of Charles Heseltine's original hand-drawn maps of all the electric railways in Maine, along with O.R. Cummings' collection of photographs and books, because he published these books. So you can see the two books, well, the Portland, Lewiston, Interurban here. And well, I'll talk about that later. I get kind of going on. Another person who was really helpful in this material for these books is Oscar Atkins. And he worked for the Portland, Lewiston, Interurban as an operator, as a conductor and a motorman. But he also led the committee for the reunions of the employees. So 5 years after it closed in 1933, they had their first reunion. It was in Gray at the New Begin building just after it had opened. And for 4 years in a row, they had that annual meeting, and members, former operators would bring in photos, or family members would bring in photos and newspaper clippings, and they put together a massive scrapbook. But so here's more on Charles Heseltine. He passed away in 1989, but as I mentioned, he retired from the fire department in South Portland. Then he went to work for the Maine Historical Society as a janitor and developed a close relationship with them. And they have 2 or 3 or 4 collections of his stuff, and because he was incredible. So this one picture on the right side is I reached out to them on his reach out to the Maine Historical Society about Charles Heseltine's collection on the PLI, and they shared stuff with me. And this is one of the pages. And what he did was he ran into all the newspaper clippings about the PLI. And this is just one page, but it's just incredible stuff. Yep. Oh,
moved away
yeah.
on us.
Interesting that it does that.
Yeah, I'm not sure why, but sometimes it just sort of. sort of does it. Sorry about that.
Oh, it's okay. So now I can still.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, and we can, sorry. We have to drag this over out of your way. And, sorry, there you go. Thanks.
So here's the scrapbook I talked about, and it basically takes two hands to turn the page. And there's 88 pages, and many of them have images or things on both sides. So we, Charles Heseltine gave it to O.R. Cummings in hopes that with O.R. Cummings and the Trolley Museum, they would conserve and save and, you know, have this available as far as digital forms. And we finally raised the $20,000 needed to conserve this and digitize at a very high res, at 800 DPI on this. So this is all done. And I have released a couple of blog posts about some of the information, but there's so much information. It's a terrific resource, and so many of these images will be used when we release the Narcissus exhibits and displays once the car is fully restored. And so some of the things they'll do, as you can see, they put like newspaper clipping in there, and they'll put the date, and that allows us to go search online to find, try to get a more clear, crisp, updated version for research purposes. So construction, old school construction right here. This is, you know, 1910, the first dirt was turned over on April 7th, 1910 at 1:13 p.m. And that's Littlefields Corner in Auburn. And you can see this is Cobb Lane, and this is Royal River in Danville. Look at the bridge construction, the initial, I mean, looks like 2x6s on some, you know, sawhorses. And then when you look at the electric, putting the overhead in place, look at the old school equipment they use. They call it a tower wagon. That's 1911 when they started doing the overhead wire. And so these are from the scrapbook collection and O.R. Cummings at the Trolley Museum. One of the important pieces of equipment early on, parting with this construction that they started getting some track down, was locomotive number 90, which was purchased in 1911, as you can see. And it was used to haul ballast and things all through that. And Morrison Hill in Cumberland, West Cumberland, was a significant place. That's where this was. The pictures here on the, that's all West Cumberland. It is, absolutely. So if you're on the Mill Road looking south, this is what you see down there. Absolutely. So Scott Libby, W.S. Libby, was an outdoors guy. And he and his family would go camping, they'd go hunting. They spent a lot of time outdoors. And being the person he was, wanting to connect community members with this electric rail line, the Portland Gray and Lewiston back in the early days, he wanted each of these cars to be elaborate, to really attract attention. And when people went for a ride on it, or the people that were working, operating these cars, he wanted those people to just really become emotionally attached. So he wanted more than just having a number assigned to each of the cars. He wanted to have a personal name. Now, initially, he was talking about having each car be named after a biblical character. Some of those names are really long and challenging to say. So he was like, well, maybe I can't, maybe that's not a good choice for this. So his two daughters suggested to him that he choose his favorite flowers because of the outdoors and name these cars after his favorite flowers. So the original 6 are all named after flowers. So the top number 12 is the gladiolus, but they went number 10 arbutus, number 12 gladiolus, 14 is Narcissus, 16 is Clematis, and then 18 Azalea. And those from 10, 12, 14, and 16 were all built in Laconia, New Hampshire at the Laconia Car Works trolley company, manufacturing company there. And two others, number 18 Azalea and number 20 Magnolia, were built by the Wasson Company in Springfield. In 1920, they added one more car, and because it was Maine's centennial, they didn't name it after a flower. W. Scott Libby had passed away, and his oldest son, who was actively involved in establishing the company at the beginning, had also died during the flu epidemic. And so they named it Maine because of the centennial, in honor of the centennial. So the interior, whether it's a Laconia-built car or a Wasson-built car, are very similar, and the exteriors are very similar, but there are some differences. So me being me, you can see the handles on this picture on the left are a little different than the seat handles on the picture on the right. So if you're wondering if this seat came from the Wasson built or from, Laconia built, you can tell by looking at the stained glass windows, you can tell by looking at the seat handles. So if you're checking out pictures, photos, and you're trying to figure out what cars it might be, you can start to narrow it down by saying, well, it's a Wasson car. Well, it's a Laconia car. You can kind of go from there. Once you get it down to that, then it's really challenging because the 3 Wasson cars are identical and the 4 Laconia cars are identical, except for the name and the number. And as years went by, those names and numbers, you might not be able to see those. And so it's tough to identify which car it actually is in those latter days. So just prior to the line opening up in 1914, W.S. Libby died in May, on May 17th. And that was a big curveball because he was the major stockholder, he and Mr. Dingley. And so the name stayed when they opened the line on July 2nd, stayed as the Portland, Gray, and Lewiston Railroad, but within a few weeks, the name changed to Portland, Lewiston, Interurban. And the ownership changed later that year, in 1914, to be out of state. And then actually in 1920, Central Maine Power bought the Androscoggin Light and Power was the owner, and that owned the Portland, Lewiston Interurban. And then Central Maine Power bought the Androscoggin Light and Power in 1920, which meant they also acquired the Portland, Lewiston Interurban. But on July 2nd, 1914 is when the Portland, Gray, and Lewiston line officially opened up. Now these scenes here, I put a lot on each slide, but I use Charles Heseltine's hand-drawn maps. So this is downtown Auburn, Lewiston, and the car house in Lewiston was on Middle Street, and that building still exists. So if you go up Middle Street, you can find what looks like this building. Of course, the exterior's changed a little bit, but the name Portland, Lewiston Interurban is still on the Facebook right there. But the whole building has become a medical center. I think Bates Street is the next street up, and so you can actually access it on Bates Street and the parking lot, but on Middle Street, you see what you kind of see where the originally was the entrance to the car barn. And this little doorway that you see in the center, that's where you would go and buy your ticket. So you walk in there's a little waiting room. You could buy your tickets. They had this sign, and O.R. Cummings acquired this Take the Interurban sign, and that was actually attached to the Lewiston ticket area. And it's porcelain and really a nice piece. And then you see the interior of the car house there on Middle Street and see the cars in there. So it's a big barn. You would go right, once you cross the bridge and you start going up, so you go by, was it Lisbon Street, I think first, and Middle Street is maybe the third street up, you take that and you'll see it on the left-hand side. You'll still see that, the front of that building there. So what would happen is they built, because they built the right-of-way 30 miles from Auburn down to Deering, to Portland. And that 30-mile right-of-way, they put poles on one side that carried the DC and powered the railways. And then they put poles on the other side that carried the AC. And so that allowed them to generate a lot of business to other communities. Because Portland, of course, was Portland and Lewiston. Lewiston, Auburn were the biggest cities at the time. Bangor is right on the cusp. But from a business standpoint, if you can get electricity and start feeding Portland, that's going to increase your revenue substantially. So that was part of the business plan for Libby, is to have that line and use that to increase the revenues for that. But with DC, that power starts to decrease a little bit as the miles go on. So you'd have to have a substation every so often to help energize the electricity on the DC. So the first one is in Danville. And so they would have their Libby Dingley Dam generating electricity, and it would go directly to that Danville station, AC, and then they would convert that into DC. And then it would go to Gray, to a substation, be re-energized, and then it would go to West Falmouth, where there's from Gray, it was West Falmouth with another substation, which also acted as a waiting station, get re-energized, and then it would, of course, use the Portland Railroad, but I'll talk about that. So they would use, when they left the station on Middle Street, they were using, at the time, the Lewiston, Augusta, and Waterville system. So they used those tracks and used their electricity. But once they entered Auburn, there's a right-of-way. Now this track that would be the main line for the Augusta-Lewiston system would go to Mechanic Falls. But at this intersection, there was a stop for the Portland-Lewiston Interurban, and this looks like a phone booth, an old wooden phone booth, but that's actually a dispatcher's station. So they would stop the Portland-Lewiston cars, conductor would get off, use a key, open it up, ring up with the crank phone, ring up the dispatcher, get their orders, write them down, close it up. Then they would enter the right-of-way on Poland Road or Poland Street, I think it's Poland Road, and start heading toward New Gloucester, Danville and New Gloucester. So once they got to Danville, there's a station there. And Don Curry, you may remember Don Curry, he passed away a year or so ago now, but he and I went on a tour doing some stuff, and we stopped at the Danville station because the building's still there. It's empty. Hasn't been repurposed other than maybe for storage. But this is, was it Oris is the road? Yeah, O-R-A-S Lane. So that's where the tracks were. And this is the station here. And again, you can see now we come into Gray. You have the Gray power station, waiting room, little tickets. And you can see this is an early picture of the line when it was first opened. And you can see the poles on either side, one side carrying the AC, one side carrying the DC. Now, it also carried a phone line, a bare phone line, so that the dispatcher could be reached. So at each end of the right-of-way, there was one of those booths so they could communicate with the dispatcher. But if there was something, this is 30-mile right-of-way, 30-mile long, with 3 major stops with those substations, which had phones, of course, that could communicate with the dispatcher. But if there was an accident, or if it was wintertime and there was a snowdrift and they had trouble, how were they going to communicate with the dispatcher? Well, they had their own cell phone back then, in 1914. Now, when I say cell phone, it's because it has a battery, a couple batteries inside, so that's the battery cell. But it's patented, and it was used in railroad systems all across the country, starting in 1903. And so what they would have is a piece of metal that could fold up that had two wires inside, and on one end there was a metal hook. And so they would unfold this wired metal hook, stick it out the window, grip it onto the bare phone wire, then take the two wires that come out at the end, and they would attach them to the phone that was the portable cell phone in the cab, and then they could ring up the dispatcher and say, I'm in trouble, you know, we've had an accident, or, you know, we got a problem with snow. But that, I've got one of those right there, which is pretty cool. And the Maine Historical Society also has one from the Arbutus. So then we go down to West Falmouth. West Falmouth had a substation and waiting room there. And one of the things we did with the original surveyor's map, you might be familiar with the New Gloucester Historical Society. And one of the board members there, Tom, he is a surveyor, professional surveyor. So I shared the digital files of the original surveyor's map, and he was very excited about it. And so he put together and did research and found what differences there were comparing the original surveyor's map to today, and then did a report and gave me that report, and then I did a blog post, so you can go find all his research. And so that's why some of these photos. And what I did was I added to that these LiDAR pieces. So when you go and check out the blog post of that piece, you'll see some of the remnants from the Portland-Lewiston right-of-way going to the different stations and going through the line. So then in Deering, the line came to, the right-of-way came to an end, another dispatcher booth there. And it's right next to the Maine Central Railroad Deering siding. And this is number 90 that happened to use that photo. And then from that, they would come off using their own electricity to using the Portland Railroad electric system, and they would come into Forest Ave. And this map here, you see Forest Avenue, and then they would come across Forest Avenue and then onto Portland, and then switch up to, so there's this car house on Portland Road, which is on a really angled elevation, so that where the tracks were, you could go, it would hold 2 or 3 cars inside, 3 or 4 cars inside. But on the opposite side, you'd have to go upstairs to the next level, Cumberland Ave, which is where this is. And initially that was going to be their passenger station, you know, their waiting station, but it never really worked out that way. They ended up renting that space out and using in Monument Square, where the Portland Railroad station, waiting station was, they just partnered up with them for a while. But then once they came into Monument Square, they would do a loop. And that loop, they would come out and then go onto what was then Middle Street. Now, Middle Street is still in existence, but the part of Middle Street no longer exists where Monument Square is, because now they've put bricks down and it's really a public venue for people to be able to congregate and do stuff and go shopping and that kind of stuff. So where there used to be tracks on Middle Street coming right to Congress Street, that part no longer exists. But back in the day, they would come, get on a little stretch of Congress Street, go on Middle Street, then onto Federal Street, then take a left onto Temple Street, and then take another left onto Congress Street to come back around. And that's what they're doing here. This is Temple Street, and this is Congress Street. So it's gone around the loop and come back, and this is where they would pick up passengers or just let passengers off. Sometimes on Temple Street, they would let people off as well, or pick people up, depending on the traffic, the time of year and stuff. Now, one of the, probably the best-known passenger on the Portland-Lewiston Interurban was Theodore Roosevelt. And the first time he rode was just a few weeks after it opened. It opened July 2nd, and on August 18th, 1914, he was a passenger. And he was campaigning for the Progressive Party candidates back then. And so he had taken a train, a Pullman car called the Hester out of Boston, went to Auburn, made a couple stops along the way, picked up some other politicians, and then in Auburn, did a little campaigning. Then he got a ride over to the station, the Portland-Lewiston Interurban station on Middle Street. And while he's waiting on the Narcissus, that's the car he was on, with his staff and some other politicians, a fellow from New York had stopped by earlier and gone fishing in Auburn Lake and had caught an 8.5-pound lake trout and heard Roosevelt was in town. So he took this 8.5-pound lake trout and delivered it, gave it to Roosevelt while he's on the Narcissus. I read this in the newspaper, like on, page 6, and one of the local things going on. And that's where you find, for me, some of the greatest little stories. It isn't just front page or a back page or a second page. It's, all these local little excerpts. And Roosevelt talks, says, bully, and what a great thing. I'm going to have it for breakfast tomorrow morning. And so that was a fun thing. And another piece I read about in that day he was riding the Narcissus from Lewiston down to Portland is as he's approaching Gray, the newspaper talks about this young girl around 10 years old standing next to the tracks with her mother. And it wasn't at the station, the substation, where the crowd for Gray was holding up. You can see in this photo here. It was prior to that, probably where the Little League fields are now, in behind New Begin. And so she's standing there and she has a bouquet of flowers and wasn't with the crowd. And the car, the Narcissus, was middle of August, hot day. The passenger doors, which are on the side at each end, on each side, were probably locked open. You could lock them open to let some air in because they're not air conditioned back then. And what I think from reading it is when the car went by slowly at first, the young girl thought, gee, there's an open door. Maybe I can toss these into the open door at the end of the car. So as the front of the car goes by, she starts taking steps toward the track, toward the car. And the newspaper says Roosevelt sees her walking toward the car. So he jumps out of his seat and runs to the back of the car and goes to the doorway entrance. And there's a couple of steps there. And he reaches down, and the young girl, they exchange she gives him the flowers. And I'm like, wow, that's a cool story. That could be a book. Then I read where in 1916, Roosevelt returned to Maine to campaign, I think for Republicans back then. But he went from Monument Square, political campaigning, got on one of the Portland-Lewiston Interurban cars, and it was the Clematis, number 16, and heading up to Lewiston. And as they're approaching Gray, his staff reminded him of this young girl from 2 years before that had given him the flowers. So when he stopped in Gray and he's talking to the crowd in 1916, he yells out to the crowd, there's a young girl here that gave me the flowers 2 years ago. And it was silence. I was like, oh. So that just hung on me for a while. And then a few years ago, I said, I got to do something about that. So, with help and suggestions from personal, professional friends, I reached out to Jean Flahive, who was already an award-winning Maine author. She and her husband live in South Portland, and connected with her. She was recommended to me, so we connected, and I shared with her what I had in mind, gave her some background to where the Narcissus was built in Laconia, New Hampshire. And of course, that was one of the very first things. And when she read that the car was built in Laconia, New Hampshire, her father grew up there. So she was like, I think I'm supposed to do this. And so she and I worked together, and she's the author of this award-winning book, Teddy Roosevelt, Millie and the Elegant Ride. All the proceeds go to benefit the Narcissus Restoration Project. It earned 3 National Book Awards and was one of the 10% best books that were considered in in 2020. So that's an exciting thing. So you see this building on the right, this yellow building, that's the original waiting station from West Cumberland from 1915. So this was on Mill Road. So the Wilson Farm was there. And so you know Nancy Wilson Latham? Any of you know Nancy? Well, she's part of the Wilson family that had the farm on Mill Road there. And she shared a lot of the family journals with me because her family worked in helping construct the right-of-way, the tracks, supplied lumber, housed people, housed a lot of the stuff on their farm, you know, separate buildings. W.S. Libby actually had a couple of meals there. So she shared all this stuff with me, and I put it into posts on this. We acquired this. I'll tell you why it got built in the first place. Initially, the Portland Lewiston Interurban, or the Portland Grand Lewiston, was only going to make like 7 or 8 stops. It's going to be high speed. Get to Portland, get to Lewiston as quick as we can. Well, all the people, mostly farmers on that right-of-way, that sold their right-of-way, you know, at 50-foot wide, in some cases right next to their farmhouse, to have those cars going by every day and not having a stop that was close to them, they were not happy about that. So they, mostly people from Gray, but others as well, reached out to the commission, the Railroad Commission, saying, we need to have some other stops. And so they mandated for 2015 that there be more local stops. So what they did was they bought, the Portland Lewiston Interurban purchased 2 additional cars, number 40 and 42. These were not interurbans, but they were very large electric streetcars. And all these other stations were built. So West Cumberland on Mill Road was built in 1915. Now, you can see, with help from Kathy Allen McDonald from West Cumberland, she and Nancy worked together a lot for doing history research in the Cumberland area, but other communities as well. They have helped me a lot with stuff. And so Dick Budd, actually, the gas station, yeah. So Dick actually initially sold it, the station, because it was in his backyard of the gas station for a while. He sold it to Kathy's mother, because her parents had a store in West Cumberland that was well known, and yeah, which is Skillins now, right? And so Kathy's mother gave Bud all this money to buy this, but she never went and picked it up. And a long time went by, and Dick was like, here's your money back. And he gave us the station. And we restored it in 1990, I think it was. And it's the first stop. If you go for a trolley ride at the Trolley Museum, you leave the visitor center, the first place you stop is right here at Morrison Hill Station. And the conductor will pick up depending on how many cars are going out, pick up a certain communication board before they go out. But this is where the ribbon cutting will be when the Narcissus is restored. It's going to be here, because this will be the first time that the Narcissus and Morrison Hill Station have been rejoined since 1933. Because the Narcissus would occasionally stop at this station. I get yakking about stuff. Now, cars 40 and 41, you know, so many of these, when the companies go out of business, I'll talk about that later. So freight service for the Portland Lewiston Interurban was a great revenue source for them. And you can find many more details on any of these blog posts, because I do go into a lot more detail. But today I'm sort of doing a summary piece on it. But freight service was important. So they had express and they had freight service. And you can see they're connected with a lot of railroads as well. So Maine Central, Grand Trunk, you might be familiar with this overpass. There was another one I saw recently that's like only a half a mile away, more toward the central station, main central station in Danville. So things went well during, up through the high number was the centennial year. That was the most passengers they carried in one year. So that's 1920. And then, World War II, because it had an impact on all electric railways in Maine in a challenging way. But things became more challenging as time went on, especially once the Depression hit. And so they actually went out of business in 1933. And we actually have this original newspaper, front page of the Interurban service coming to a close. They gave like a week's notice in advance. And then what did the companies do? Well, streetcar systems, what they would do is they were upgrading their cars. Sometimes those cars were still in good enough shape they could sell the cars to a different electric railway company. And sometimes they weren't in good shape or nobody was interested in buying them. So what they would do is they'd scrap out the metal part and try to sell the body separately. And some people would buy it for a shed or any number of different things. If it was in a touristy kind of area like Old Orchard Beach, they might put a couple of beds in them and rent them out in the summertime. You never know. Some people turn them into a room, at their house, or turn them into a whole house, or any number of things. And so in 1933, here we are in the Depression. These cars are massive cars, and it required 2 people to operate the cars. And they had 4 90 horsepower motors, because they, in regular service, were doing 60 miles an hour in a number of stretches, but they could exceed 70 miles an hour if that's what was needed. Consumed a lot of electricity. So in the 30s, they didn't sell a single one of these, of the cars they had, as far as a complete car for use anywhere else. That wasn't going to happen. They tried to, and you can see this car bodies. So they tried to, didn't have any luck. They sold one, which you'll see in the next series of pictures. What they did mostly was just scrap out the metal and then sell the bodies. And so they did sell some of those bodies. So number 40 and 42, those bodies got sold from those cars up here. Those bodies got sold. And here's this one right here is the Maine. And so that was a restaurant for a while, and then became storage for the store that was next door. So I list where they went, or if we ever will identify where they went. Most of them were scrapped. The Arbutus is the one that was sold as a complete car, and it was sold to one of his daughters. And she was the first passenger in 1914 and happened to be on the Arbutus. And the Arbutus was the last car to operate as a passenger car. And she was on that ride as well. So she bought the complete car, the Arbutus, in the end of 1933, and had it shipped, which is what you see as this picture right here, had it shipped to her summer place in Bayview and Saco on the coast. And she lived in Saco on North Street. One of her sons actually was mayor of Saco for a while. So she moved it, put it on a piece of track, and it was a memorial to her father, who she, of course, loved. And she made it a tea house because it was known as a survivor of the Portland Lewiston Interurban. Any electric rail fans knew it was there and wanted to go visit. So they would go and get permission to do selfies with it, of course. But she would also host, because Charles Heseltine reached out to her through the ERA about including her stop in a fan trip in 38, 39, 40. Well, a 1940 trip, Trolley Museum members, a couple of those early members, also attended. And the fellow who we considered to be the one who led the group, Ted Santorelli, he actually had a conversation with Mrs. Gertrude Libby Anthony and said, we just started this, we have 3 or 4 cars now on property here in Kennebunkport. We're just a few miles away. And, when you feel it's time that you want to, we'd love to have the Arbutus. It's a complete car. We literally could just put, power to it and it's going to operate because you've done such a great job in maintaining it. And she was like, well, it's not time now. You know, my father, you know, it's a memorial, so I'm not going to do that. But, you know, we'll see. So then 41 came, all those guys went off to World War II, served in World War II, and we haven't learned yet specifically how this happened, but she scrapped the car out in 45. Now, she did save some of the components, donated some of them to the Maine Historical Society, like one of the cell phone from the Arbutus is at the Maine Historical Society, some of the brass things, some of the things inside. But she was close with the Gray Historical Society, and Charles Heseltine helped make that connection because of the reunions that went on for 4 years in Gray, and she would attend some of those and provided some photos to some of those. And so she donated a number of things from the Arbutus to the Gray Historical Society. The headlight, you see where this name, you know, you can, the destination signs on the top, so they have one of those. They actually let us borrow, because we work with them, and they actually let us borrow that sign so we could replicate that for the 2 signs we're going to put on the Narcissus. So the Narcissus, the body of the Narcissus was sold to a fella who was going to have a diner at Sabattis Pond, Sabattis Lake. Some people call it pond, some lake, but it's in Sabattis. And here's an actual photo that one of our members took. And this is the Narcissus, but as the Sabattis Diner. It didn't go well. I found some newspaper articles about it. One day somebody one night broke into it and did some damage to it. So it didn't work out so well. So he sold the body to Mr. Vallee for $100. And Mr. Vallee turned it into his family's summer camp at Sabattis Lake. And they lived there like 25 or 30 years. And he had ridden on interurbans between Lewiston and Portland. So he cared about this. So he actually retained like the stained glass and different things. And you can see this photo here of Mr. Vallee with one of his sons, Dan. And they added on the back side that you can't see from the photo on the right, but on the back side, they added a kitchen and they have a stove. And early members in the mid-60s reached out to Mr. Vallee saying, you know, we'd love to acquire the body of the Narcissus when you're ready to, you know, move out of it or whatever. And he said, well, when I get to retire, if you build me a replacement house, I'll sign over the body of the car. And so that actually took place. One of the members led that fundraising and got donations from different businesses to provide materials and labor and financial donations. And they went up and over a period of time removed that kitchen, which is where this is, that building, that part's done, and they positioned it so they could put it up on, get it out of the way so they could build his new property, which is in this picture here that I'm highlighting, you know, putting around with the arrow. And then our volunteers loaded it on to a trailer that we made specifically at the museum to haul trolley cars from all around the country with this truck. We call it the Highway Monster. And it arrived at Seashore Trolley Museum. This is a photo of it arriving on Halloween, October 31st, 1969. And the interior, because they were living inside, they painted like everything white. So the mahogany, all painted white for helping to light things up. So there's been, and it's just the body. There were no original seats, none of the mechanical stuff. So we had to find all the materials or what materials we might be able to find to help operate it and put it together. We had our governor in 1965, Mr. Reed, was on our board back then. And our members at that time found a car that was going to be scrapped in Canada that had trucks made by the same company as the ones for the Narcissus. They weren't identical trucks, but there were components on those trucks that could be used for building trucks for the Narcissus. So the governor got involved, and through his staff, the trucks from that car in Canada that was being scrapped were donated to the Trolley Museum as a gesture of international goodwill for the Narcissus, and we have those trucks. But we needed more. So we had volunteers from the Trolley Museum, 3 volunteers that went to Japan for 2 weeks back in 99 or 2000, 2001. And they had connections, professional connections with the electric railway companies in Japan. And after World War II, just like we sent a lot of stuff over to Europe to help rebuild Europe, we sent stuff to Japan to help rebuild Japan. Trolley cars were some of the things we sent in both directions. Well, in Japan, they maintained the maintenance at a very high level. So in 99, 2000, they were still operating some of those cars that had been sent over there back after World War II. But they were on a list of to be scrapped in some period of time. So those members of ours went over there working with those electric railway people saying, okay, which cars are going to be scrapped? And then they would look at those cars, see what parts, which components could match up with cars we're trying to restore at the Trolley Museum, that we didn't have access to those parts. And I think a couple different tractor trailer came, and 3 additional sets of trucks for the Narcissus came. Now, there are portions from each of those 3 sets that will be used along with the other set that we had to help rebuild from scratch 2 complete, or 1 set, 2 trucks for the Narcissus. It's quite a project. So here's the picture of the Narcissus coming into the restoration shop at Seashore Trolley Museum in 2015. You can see where the leaded stained glass windows go over the passenger windows. That's these arches. And you can see this is the Portland Lewiston sign from Gray Historical Society they let us borrow that we could do. This is the Maine Historical Society cell phone from the Arbutus. And here's a newspaper clipping from the scrapbook about the phone being used in the cars back in the day. Now, these are paints. And actually, I was talking to the fellows before we went live that Don Curry and I did a presentation for the Portland Railroad Club in Portland back in 2016, I think. And one of the members at the time, he and Donald had been roommates in college for a period of time. So they were talking family stuff. And your member's daughter works in Augusta and works in the historical restoration of buildings and paint and all that. So made that connection with Donald, and she came down and did the testing for the Narcissus, exterior, interior, all over the place, so we could identify what the true color of the original car is, because in the write-up it's just dark green, you know. And so you read some, and it'll talk about these cars in certain light were called the black cars, or the black beauties, because they were very shiny, but they were like really black. But in other light, they were green. And that's how this color is. So here is the first time we had a batch, you know, like a quart of paint mixed from that research that was done. And this is the same stick, the same paint, the same day, just in different light. So this top one to me looks almost black, whereas the bottom one is certainly green, but it's the same piece of wood, the same paint. Cool. So here are some of the leaded stained glass windows. So there were some that were broken on the Narcissus and some that were missing, not many. But the Arbutus, somehow all the windows up in the clear story, and in this picture of the Narcissus, this top second roof, I'll call it, that's the clear story up there. And all the leaded stained glass windows up there from the Arbutus ended up at a trolley museum in Connecticut. And they happened to see one of our newsletters, I think it was in 2000 or 2002, where we were doing some restoration work on the Narcissus. And so they reached out to us saying, we have some leaded stained glass windows from one of the sister cars, the Arbutus. So they needed some parts that we had that they didn't have, so we did a swap. And so they gave us all these leaded stained glass windows from the Arbutus, and I have one of the original ones right here today from 1912. And so then one of the very first things we did in 2015 was have all those windows fully restored, and it was done in Saco. And one of the really cool things is the woman, Deb Karen Plord, had years doing restoration of old-time leaded stained glass, churches, different things. So she was able to identify 2 different manufacturers of this leaded stained glass, because depending on which, if it's sort of this whitish, yellowish, that's one company, but the stuff in the middle, the kind of flowery looking thing, that was a different company. Both those companies were still in business in 2015. And they still had the original glass on the shelf in like pieces like 20 by 20 that was used for the Narcissus in Laconia. So we were able to, we got the last few pieces that do the green, but the whitish, yellowish stuff is still a fairly common piece. But how cool is that to be able to go to the original manufacturer and still get stuff right off the shelf that was used back in the day? I like all those stories. So here's a restoration of the Narcissus. So we acquired the Narcissus, finding lots of parts over many, many years, doing exchanges with different trolley museums around the country, like I say, Japan, going all over. One of the challenging things when we first brought it in is identifying, when we first used laser to see how off the body was, it was so close. Now this thing had been off its tracks since 1933, just a body on the ground, you know, or just on, you know, some 4x4s or something, and then been on a trailer at the Trolley Museum for literally all these years. And yet, once we had it in the shop and headed up and did lasers, from one end to the other, 40-some feet long, it was off like a quarter of an inch, half an inch. Now, the construction of this, it's one of the transition cars. It went from all wood to having some steel components. So there's 2 I-beams from one end to the other down the center. And then on the passenger compartment, which is in between what they call the vestibules, where the passengers walk in, the motormen or the conductors are, the passenger compartment is like 36, 37 feet long. There's wooden side sills that are southern yellow pine, and they're set into channel steel. So there are some steel components in this car. But when it's all assembled, it's really hard to tell how deteriorated those 37-foot long side sills are, because the channel steel kind of covers it over. And then all the window posts plug into the top of the wooden part of that sill. So you can see some, I'll say some rot, some deterioration here and there. But gee, you say, if it was really bad, wouldn't the laser say you're off 2 or 3 inches or 4 or 5 inches? It's only off that much. It's really not too bad. And when you go around and hold on to those window posts, they were really sturdy. Yet Ernie Eaton, who is a staff member in the shop, but initially he was a volunteer helping with the Narcissus, he really got into it and identified that we really, because this is on the National Register of Historic Places, even though we don't have federal funding or any state funding, you know, this is a really important car in the museum's collection. It's going to be, you know, when it's restored, it's going to be one of the top 3 or 4 cars from an operation standpoint to have visitors come from all over the country to come and see. We really want to do the right thing while we're taking this thing apart, even though it's going to take more time, it's going to take longer, you know, we may find it's fine, but we really can't identify whether it really is or not unless we take it apart. Thankfully, we took it apart and found we did indeed have to replace both of those side sills. Now you want to replace it with old growth southern yellow pine. And this is one of the reasons why, which is why I have this picture here. Here, this is old growth southern yellow pine. When you cut that off, you count might be 10, 15, might be as many as 30 rings per inch. So that means it really struggled in growing in a forest. So it's really tough, hard wood to work with. If it's wood that you buy, I'll say commercially today, that's been farmed and grown as fast as it can so they can cut it down and sell it, then you look at this piece of wood, which is southern yellow pine, same size, but there might be 5, maybe 6 rings per inch. So the strength for that on a 37-foot timber is, we can't do that. So we went in search of old growth southern yellow pine timber. It took us a while to find it, but we did in Springfield, Mass. But they had it had about a 40-footer that was about 11.5, almost 12 inches by 12 inches. So we could cut that and get 2 timbers out of that, 1 for each side. And that came out of an old brass factory in Connecticut from the 1800s. And one of the cool things, when that was cut, of course, with wood like that, once you cut, if it's going to be set in something like this channel, especially if it's 37 feet long, once you've cut and refreshed it and it's starting to breathe again, that wood is going to warp. So once it was cut, we had to get it to the museum as fast as we could from Springfield. And then we had to drill the holes and line things up. Now, while they're doing this, where the knots are in the wood, they were bleeding. Now, the original 40-footer was used in construction like in 1880. How old was the tree prior to it being cut down and used in 1880 in a building? And yet you cut it open in 2020 and the knots are bleeding. That's crazy. So we had to get the holes cut, everything's lined up and fit into the steel channel, and then have them dry while they're connected into that steel channel, so that when we get to the point where we can apply them back and start rebuilding the exterior of the car, we're all good. And that's been done. As you can see, I get yacked. Now, just taking the old bolts and stuff out from underneath that car took Ernie, not just Ernie, but Ernie spent so many hours. God bless him. And making the arches, you can see we had a volunteer from South Portland who was able to, originally to Scarborough, but then to South Portland, moved to South Portland, was able to, he's just very gifted. His father actually worked for, was one of the initial operators for, what's the car that James is involved in helping save? It's in New Hampshire now. It's going to be restored. They just moved it, acquired it from the state. Yeah, the Flying Yankee. So this fella's father was, and I have pictures of that. It's in one of the blog posts while he's doing this work, because I went to his shop and took pictures, and there was a Roosevelt sign there. He says, oh yeah, my father was a Roosevelt fan, but he worked for the B&M for like 40 years, and he was one of the first operators of the Flying Yankee, and he gave his, sign-in sheet and what date he was and all that stuff. So that's posted in one of the posts. Did an incredible job. And we were able to hire Seth Reed, who is a master woodworker. And you can see he's working on this mahogany interior with the inlay, and he's able to repair all that. He spent hundreds and hundreds of hours on all this small mahogany pieces from the interior of the Narcissus. My God. Doors, and then if he had to replicate a piece, some of it is so complicated. So the interior on the ceiling in the center is all gold leaf. It was painted over in white while the Valleys lived there. This is all original stuff, brass stuff from inside. We have to make the seats. We were fortunately, one of our second car that we acquired in the collection, that came in 1940 from Manchester, New Hampshire, but it was built in Laconia, New Hampshire in 1906 as car number 38. And because it was built by Laconia, it's an Interurban car, there's a lot of similarities in the construction pieces as the Narcissus. And so the seats themselves are a little different, the material's a little different, but the components that make up the seat are the same. So we're able to dismantle one of those seats and use those metal components to have these, and Ernie did all this, to have these made so that then we could have the foundry cast the components so we can build 20 seats. So the details that go into making this come together. I mean, look at this one board that Seth worked on. This is the condition that was in, and this is, and you have to do all this pre-planning, and you have to spend so much time, because once you identify what the cutting has to be, if you don't do it in the right steps, then what you find is you start cutting, and then you get to this one, you go, oh, darn, I can't do that now without ruining something. So you have to be so precise, not only in your measurements, but in the process of making those cuts. Well, Ernie reached out. Ernie's professional background led him to look into SolidWorks 3D CAD. And so he worked for a while on this app that was available to the public, the general public, to see if that was going to work for us. And once he really had a sense for, yeah, it's going to take a lot of time and energy and effort, but for this project, we need that. And so once he was able to identify that and put together a package, he actually approached SolidWorks with what we're doing and what he's leading on this. And they donate 5, I'm going to call them apps, for their CAD program. And commercially, they charge $10,000 per year for each one of those. And they give them to us free because they're so impressed with what Ernie is doing, using that system on the Narcissus. They put it in their newsletter that they put out all over the world. So, Ernie and Seth working together on this, and it's not just Ernie and Seth, but Ernie is the project manager for the Narcissus, so he focuses his attention on the Narcissus, but of course, like anybody in the shop or volunteer, you do other things too. Right. Yeah, and so again, the details, you can look at a restoration post and get into the details of Seth working on some of this stuff and using the 3D CAD stuff, whether it's for metal work or whether it's for woodwork. I mean, just identifying a proper candidate for that 40-foot, 12 by 12 side sill that could be cut, because they've been used in construction for these old mills. They might already have holes or cracks or different things, but because Ernie had put together where every single hole needed to be done in a 3D version for each side sill, he could take that version. It's like watching a movie where they're doing this, in the air, but you're seeing all these things move around. It's kind of like that. And he goes, okay, this is the one that they think will work. It's got a crack here that goes this far. Well, if I turn it this way, well, no, that's not going to work. Oh, this big hole is over, nah, that's not going to. So that's why it took so long to find a candidate that was going to be manageable to match up with all the different cuts and holes that needed to be drilled for each of those side sills. It's incredible, really. So here are the 4 different sets of trucks that I talked about, and they've, back in 2019, they started dismantling that so we could start to identify that, because we had a financial ability to be able to do that. But 2020 came with COVID, and that derailed a lot of things. But we have the plan, it's just having the money to implement the plan, which is a struggle right now. Well, we took them apart because the actual wheels, none of these sets are the proper wheel. So we're going to have to manufacture the wheels, the 4 wheels for each of those 2 trucks from scratch. We would farm it out. Might be the BA&R, BA, is it up in Bangor? Might be. We'll see. We're not there yet, but we're going to have them made. Now, it originally came with 4 90 horsepower motors. We could not find 90 horsepower motors that were available to acquire. I mean, all the motors we have, nothing 90 horsepower. That's really a challenging piece. So we decided, even if we had 4 miles of track when one way, if we had all the right of way, the likelihood of putting the Narcissus on there and getting it up to 60 miles an hour, I don't know if we'd do that. So ultimately we decided that we have these 4 60 horsepower motors, and they will work, they will fit in the trucks, and that'll get us to the speed that will be manageable and safe at the Trolley Museum. So we've got these 4 trucks and spent the money and got those all done up here in Auburn. So that was done. Here's some of the 3D stuff that I talked about. Here's a headlight, and you can see, you get into the details that, and Ernie has to put those specs for each individual item, every screw, bolt, nut, hole. I mean, just, I mean, curtains. We have some original curtains, and there's the 3D section. So the current work that's just taking place right now is these trusses. And you might be familiar with trusses and the components that make up a truss, but here's how the 3D SolidWorks works. So in the interior wall is the upper truss that goes down through the side sill and connects to the trucks, you know, the cross beam. And so these are all the 3D CAD pictures. And you can see what condition the original stuff is in. Now, so many of the bolts are square-headed bolts, nuts and bolts. The deterioration can be pretty massive. But for these truss pieces, Ernie was able to acquire, you know, with the museum, a welder so that they could actually salvage original ones that were so worn, but you could build them up through welding and then machine them down and build them up and machine them down and have them be working. Same with some of the actual components of the truss work themselves. You could weld it up, and once you found what the components were, the original metal, because sometimes the weldability of those old metal is, it just falls apart when you're trying to weld it. But Ernie is a focused research individual, and he finds the answers and gets it done. And volunteers help with the machining. And here's one of the ones they welded up and worked. We had this piece, machine, you know, the foundry remade that one. And then just early in October or late October, for the side sill, they're lining up where the truss rod's going to go through, and there's the hole that was drilled through the old side sill, right there. And it's where this 3D version comes through at an angle, and that's what Seth and Ernie did. And Seth, they put it at an angle. So their side sills are very close to getting done. You can see all these components are all 3D. Ernie, you know, there's the flooring in the smoking compartment. And I brought in a section, the original section from 1912 when it was made, here tonight. Again, these are all interior photos from the 3D versions that Ernie's put together of the seats and the exterior. This one here, he's able to, okay, let's say the Narcissus is on the track next to the West Cumberland Morrison Hill Station, and you're inside the car. And that's what this image is here on the left. It's if you're in the Narcissus, in the smoking compartment, looking out the window at the track, and you can see Morrison Hill Station, and you can see the car barn on the side. So this is my last slide. So we're still raising funds for the Narcissus project. The book that was published, Teddy Roosevelt, Millie and the Elegant Ride. The book is available at various bookstores. If you go to Thompson Orchard. You can buy the books there in New Gloucester. You can, at Gray Historical Society, you can buy the books there, New Gloucester Historical Society. Let's see, Androscoggin Historical Society, Maine Historical Society, you can buy the books. If you're interested in an ebook or an audiobook, you can go onto Amazon and buy it there, but all the proceeds all go to help the Narcissus project. I have brochures, you can make donations online. You can see the Fund 816, every fund at the Trolley Museum that is what they call restricted, means if you make a donation to that particular fund, the money can only be used for that project. So the Narcissus Restoration Fund is Fund 816. You could do it online or write a check and mail it to the museum, but that's it. For the Teddy Roosevelt book, Maine Historical Society actually created 8 units of lesson plans for grades 6, 7, and 8 based on this book. Some of it's about Theodore Roosevelt as president, some of it's about agriculture in Maine, and some of it's about electric railroads, like the Portland-Lewiston Interurban. And then we created classroom lesson plans for vocabulary, reading, and writing for grades 3 through 8. And all those plans are available free online through the museum's website. If you just look for the title of this book, of course, is The Elegant Ride. So if you type in www.trolleymuseum.org/elegant-ride, you go directly to the site that has all those lesson plans. And you can download them, whether it's homeschoolers or classroom teachers, they're all there. So as you can tell, I can just go on and on about this. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them for you. But thank you very much.
You want to take questions?
Sure.
One question. Is
Yes?
it true that the Narcissus is the last survivor of the Portland-Lewiston Interurban line?
What was it again? Sorry, there was a noise behind me that distracted me. Could you repeat the question?
Sorry. Is it true that the Narcissus is the last survivor of the Portland-Lewiston
Yes, that
line?
is true. Yes, that is true. Yes.
I must say it was
you referred
I
to the
must say
blog
it is a
several
very
times.
interesting story to tell about.
You referred to blogs several times. Can you give us the address so we can get into those blogs?
Sure. If you just type in Narcissus 1912, it'll probably pop up in Google as one of the very first, if not the first and second. But the actual site itself is www.blogspot, or actually narcissus1912.blogspot.com. So www.blogspot. No.
Okay, thank you.
www.narcissus1912.blogspot.com. Sorry. But if, like I say, if you go just to Google and type in Narcissus 1912, it'll pop up because it's such a popular post. And the most recent one, I did a it's this slideshow. So I released that yesterday. So if you want to see the slideshow that I just went through on a blog, I could add more description and I could add links to connect you with more details about whatever that slide was about. So if you just go to the original Narcissus 1912, the first post you're going to see is for the 470 Club slide with a lot more links and details that you can access about the story, about the start of the PLI, the end of the PLI, where the cars all went, all that stuff, all the details for that. Or if you want to learn about the Portland Railroad or Riverton Park. The Riverton Park post has over 100 photographs of Riverton Park. I mean, it's just, there's a whole lot of information on that blog. If you're interested in Theodore Roosevelt and you want to know what communities he's, connected with in Maine, there's like 30 of them. You can find all that stuff. I mean, I never knew. I used to travel up to, say, Naples, and I'd be going up through, Westbrook and that area, and I'd see an address that would say Roosevelt Trail. And I was like, what, Roosevelt has a connection? Which Roosevelt? I'd never heard of Roosevelt being over here. And what I learned was the reason that was called Roosevelt Trail is after Theodore Roosevelt passed away, the group got together and wanted to try to find a way to do memorials for him on a national basis. And one of the things they came up with was the Theodore Roosevelt International Highway. And that actually starts on Congress Street in Portland, Maine, and goes 4,060 miles, including up into Canada, and goes all the way to Portland, Oregon. So if you know where Longfellow Square is, where his statue is Longfellow sitting, that is the beginning of the Theodore Roosevelt International Highway right there. Nope, because that's Franklin. But the museum up at Campobello just took 25 of these books. They're selling these Teddy Roosevelt books up there. So if you need to get one and you're up in Canada, you can get one at Campobello. Other question?
Yeah, Phil, Dave Brown from Mass Bay RRE here. First of all, just a fascinating presentation that really illustrates the complexity of trying to restore a car like the Narcissus. And just so many elements of it that I don't think a lot of us appreciate who aren't actively involved in preservation. So that was really educational. Do you have a sense of when the Narcissus project will be completed?
Well, it's all money driven. We have the staff. We have access to the plans of what's going to happen. If we had the financial resources, we would be much have a higher level of confidence of when it would get done. But there's still a lot to do. We are, with the truss setup being done and finishing up some of the underneath of the car, we're looking, I think, pretty closely at starting to put the side sills back on. And once you get those on, then you're starting to look at the exterior of it being completed, because we have literally all the other exterior stuff that can be done, all the sideboards, and we were able to locate old school poplar, because the exterior is a lot of poplar. And we found through a resource, a bank barn in Akron, Pennsylvania, that was going to be raised. And you might know a bank barn is called that because they build them into the side of a hill to help with keeping the temperature consistent throughout the seasons. And so one of the sills for that is poplar, and it was 60 feet long, a poplar timber. And one of the beams inside holding up one of the floors was 15 feet tall and 22 inches across. And that was just enough old poplar for us to have it all, cut into what we needed for sideboards and roof boards and all the different poplar that we needed. And one of the cool things they found when they were working on that 60-footer is they found some 50 caliber musket balls shot into it. And they gave them to me. I don't know when those might have been shot into it, but there's all these little things that we find throughout the process that will all be part of the displays and exhibits once the Narcissus is done, because it is such a story. I mean, I started working on it in 1999. It had already been here for 30 years.
God. Just a follow-up question, and first of all, I'll just say that we had provided a major grant toward the restoration of the ACL 100 a number of years ago. And I know you were a driving force in getting that project completed in, as I understand it, pretty much record time. And we were on the donor, and we were all thrilled to ride behind that motor after it was completed.
That was the guinea pig for the federal and state application for the Narcissus.
Okay.
The electric locomotive 100. That was the guinea pig for the Narcissus. And yes,
Right.
we once we had access to the money, we were able to complete the work in 3 years within budget.
Yeah. One of the things that, and I'll take this more as commentary than criticism, but it seems that over the years, and I'm involved in our grant program, we get requests for, and we funded, the 4175, the 5821, the 38, and I wonder if projects might get completed faster if there's just a focus on, let's get this one done. If you've got the volunteers and the issue is money, maybe the money comes quicker if you're really focused on getting one thing done, like you did with the ACL 100.
Yeah, the thing with the electric locomotive, when I went through that sort of learning process about the application and reached out to other museum executive directors at the time, and including Scott Becker down at Pennsylvania Trolley Museum, who had a great amount of success in getting that funding. And he was able to share with me the challenges that might be there, the obstacles and stuff. So in particular, he really was a great resource for that. So we changed in saying, instead of doing a guinea pig of being Narcissus, which is going to be a really complicated, long run, let's do one that we feel we can kind of stack the deck and enhance the ability for us to succeed, and then use that success to leverage the application for the Narcissus and learn from that experience. So we used the ASL 100. It's not a passenger car. It's not elaborate. It's just a bare bones electric locomotive that was, and still, is on the National Register of Historic Places, and one of only 2 of its type in all of North America. The other one's in British Columbia, but a roof collapsed on it, so I don't know if it's been restored or will be restored. But anyway, so it took a while to get through the application, getting it approved and stuff, but initially, it only had $55 in its restoration fund in 2000, and we needed $180,000. And we had to have 20% of that for our portion of the federal and state funding. So with that focus, you're right. Once you had the money, we had the volunteers and the paid staff and the experience to do a great job, and that certainly showed in the results. Some of these other projects are just challenging. Even if you get them done, they may operate for a relatively short period of time, and something else is triggered that wasn't a problem, but now that everything's together, it's the weak link in the chain that triggers something, and that leads to additional financial needs to do something and sidetracks it because now you've refocused on other projects. So I understand, but also it's a challenge now.
Is a new model railroad building, which is going to be, a very different sort of attraction for you folks up there, is that ultimately just from admissions or whatever going to be able to support some of your other preservation activities?
Well, the negotiation, I was not part of the negotiations, but my understanding is the negotiations included that this being something outside of our initial comfort zone, the professionals aspect said, well, we need to consider that it may take us a while to build up that public presence because it's not something we've ever done before. I mean, we've had models come for a weekend or we've done something here and there, but to have it be a year-round public presence with a retail outlet and management and all that, that was a little difficult. So part of the, I'll say, working out the collaboration with the funder was to have funding in there over a 10-year period that included staffing and maintenance of the building and all that, so that that would allow us a period of time to help us work out a plan that was going to be financially balancing, so we could make it all pay off. And so that helps us in working this out. So one of the plans is the person that we've hired, that's been hired, that is starting just in the last few weeks, is an education professional, as well as being a model railroad person. And so by having that additional aspect of education involved in it, what broadens the opportunities for the public presence and how the system can be used for the public. And it's not just model railroad, there's a whole education piece that can be used to help provide leverage to other aspects within the community. So I don't know if I guess I'm kind of going around a circle a little bit about,
That's okay.
I understand your question and
Yeah,
your
it's a
concern.
whole new setup for you folks, and it's probably going to take some time. And I'm not privy to all the
Right.
various funding sources and financial arrangements, but it does seem like a great opportunity to increase your visibility and, in the long run, increase your revenue stream.
We held, the executive director and the board held an open house for people in the community. And when I say community, I'm not talking just local. I'm talking, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, people that might have an interest in volunteering at the Trolley Museum. And it could be in any aspect. It could be in the gardening, flower gardens. It could be restoration, could be in the model railroad, any aspect of operations as an operator. And we had I think it was 40 people turned out for that Saturday afternoon. And half of them were in the model railroad. So that was the first place. They wanted to see what the model railroad is about, because they were considering that would be where they'd like to volunteer, was in the model railroad. So that was pretty cool. But to have just 40 people, and they came, yes, locally, Kennebunk, Port, Saco, but also came from southern New Hampshire and Massachusetts too. So the museum, like I say, I've been involved since 1991. There are, since we have had outside professionals with skill sets that weren't necessarily the strengths for volunteers that we've had over the years, have definitely made a positive impact on that community connection and drawing in people from the community to look at how they might like to help, because they're happy with coming and attending events or going for a ride. But our special events have been very well attended. Like I say, the Pumpkin Patch event had 4,680 people attend, just that one event. And that's an event I created 26 years ago, one weekend. So, that's, that having all those people bring families and have, in this case, that event, people that were, brought their own kids and now bringing their own adult kids with their grandkids, coming to the same event and expressing how much joy they have in attending it. I came up with that whole thing thinking about back in the day, in the early days, when you talked about people that attended the Trolley Museum. Oftentimes that emotional connection was because they had family connections directly to electric streetcars. It might have been their father, their grandfather, that were operators for different electric railways. Maybe they rode the trolleys to go to school in whatever city they were in. Maybe they grew up in a particular city and we had the trolley car from that city. So it made this personal, emotional connection. But generally, it was because of that family connection with operations. Well, generations now have passed. And yes, if you're in Boston or New Orleans, some New York, you might have that emotional, but for the most part, I didn't think that was the case, that you'd have to find some other emotional connection that would draw the general public in and want them to become part of the organization. And having an event that was family oriented, and Pumpkin Patch Trolley was the one that, you know, I thought might help get us going in that direction, seems to have paid off. I'll just say that. Because now people come, and it's not necessarily the family connection from riding the trolleys when they were growing up, or when, you know, in public operations. It's when they were growing up and visiting the trolley museum and riding trolleys and being with their family and being with their grandparents or their parents, and they wanna, that's special to them. And when that happens, I think that's a positive thing for the organization, for the museum, so. Any other questions?
I'm done.
So how do you wrap things up?
We all walk out the Zoom door, I think.
No, just curious whether
Thank you, Sean.
the stations were along from Portland to Auburn. I know
Yeah.
you said there was one in, what, the first stop was in Morrison's Hill?
Well, the substations, which are also the waiting stations, there was Danville, there was Gray, and there was West Falmouth. And there were waiting stations all along, like in South Gray, there was one, New Gloucester, Upper New Gloucester. So there were, in the publications and in the blog posts, you can see where those various ones were. Now, sometimes they would just literally pull over and just let people off. So there wasn't a specific station, waiting station.
I
they
drive
found.
school bus for Yarmouth. One of our drivers lives in Danville Junction. She's living in a train station. I wasn't sure if it was that or the one for the main central or the Grand Trunk.
Well, the one in Danville is a brick building that still exists. All three actually still exist. Two of them are homes. They've been converted into private homes. But the Danville one, when I went there in 2017, was just like a storage area. It wasn't, nobody was living in it. There was people that lived next door and probably own it, but it's on Oras Lane in Danville.
I'm not sure where it is.
Yeah.
Somewhere there, but two railroads interchange somewhere in that.
Yeah.
section.
Yeah, because I don't think where the Portland, Lewiston, Interurban Danville station is, I don't think the railroad is right there. If you keep going south, that's where the underpass for the Grand Trunk was. So it was a little further south from
So
the
it must be around
Danville
100
station.
must be around 100 or something.
Close, yep, very close. It goes basically where 95, it goes right near where 95 is, south of the Danville.
Get to work on dinner. Phil, I got one last question.
Oh, okay.
The right of way through Gray, was that
Yep.
was that the same right of way that the main narrow gauge was looking at relocating to?
Yes, it is.
Okay,
Yes, sir. They were going to use that. And my understanding is once they were looking to move forward with that, and they started doing, the community was doing the investigation of that property, they found maybe there was some environmental issues. And I think that might have been one of the obstacles that they weren't going to be able to overcome.
I think it was the wetlands.
Yeah, right.
whatever.
That's why
it was.
they didn't move.
Well, it was also going to cost them a pile of money to move. In the end, they made the right decision to stay on the waterfront.
Yeah. Now, right next to that is a little strip mall where main narrow gauge is going to be. There's a strip mall. Have you been up there to where they were going to have where they were looking to move? Have you visited that area in Gray?
I have not.
One time I did in November 2015.
Okay. So there's a strip mall there, and there's a brewery, a beer brewery there. And I visited them today because the owners are family members of the young girl that I feature in the book.
It's a small world.
Yeah, it sure is. So,
Alrighty, if we don't have any other questions, let's give a round of applause to Phil. That was a great presentation tonight.
Good.
Thank you for tuning
you.
in and have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Bill. Bye.